Well, good morning, everybody. We have a good number of people on, so I think we're going to get started right now. Hopefully, everyone is having a good start to their morning. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Mike Lozier. I'm the portfolio leader for Enlist, and I'll let my colleague introduce himself.
Dr. Eric Schroeder, U.S. Crop Protection Technical Lead.
Thank you, Eric. And guys, we're thankful to have everybody jump on and wanted to make the most of our time. But first and foremost, thank you for joining this Enlist webinar rooted in best management practices. And also, we're going to give an update with regards to last season. So you can see the agenda here in front of you, hopefully. We're going to give a recap on 2024. So when we do that, we're going to pause and we're going to have some time for Q&A, actually two different sessions throughout our time here this morning on the call. And as you guys do have questions, we'd love it if you'd use the Zoom feature, depending on how you have your computer set up. It'll be at the bottom of your screen or probably the top of your screen, and it just says Q&A. If you have a question as we go, feel free to click on that and enter, type in your question, and we'll either answer it as we go or we'll save it and get to it during one of two different scheduled Q&A sessions. So that's the plan for today. We're excited that you're on, and I'll just kind of start things off before I turn it over to Eric. First, we wanted to go through, 2024 Enlist, kind of give a recap. So these are some of the headlines. We're thankful to be working on this portfolio and delivering value to farmers. It is, the number one soybean trait with the Enlist weed control system. When you think about Enlist E3 soybeans across the U.S., the trait, the seed is planted on 65% of total U.S. soybean acres in 2024. It's a huge number. It's kind of a rallying cry for us internally. We're proud of that number, but the most important thing is us delivering value, not just getting on acres, but, what's this product doing and this system doing? But the germplasm is elite. We're having very good yield results. We've had very good yield results with this E3 soybean. We know from a crop protection standpoint on the weed control, near zero volatility and reduced drift, something we've been saying since day one. And it continues to perform year over year. We have the tank mix flexibility with glufosinate. So when we think about reliable U.S.-based production, we all know the COVID year put a constraint on, our U.S. supply chain. And we're thankful that, after some bumps there, we've experienced relatively no major supply issues outside of, where everyone struggled back in 2020 and bleeding into 2021. But we've been a reliable supplier here, and we're thankful we're able to do that. So we talk about proven track record. Some of these are marketing headlines, being neighbor friendly. We did launch this responsibly. We're in constant communication with EPA, stewardship, and just regulatory, right? We make sure we turn in our training hours. We're not doing this on our own. We're really doing this from a system standpoint, U.S. agriculture standpoint, working with our different agencies. And then university and third-party tested, continue to have great results and partnerships there. And at the end of the day, it's results, and we think that we do provide a better choice for farmers. So again, more of the kind of the headlines, but let's get into maybe some of the numbers and break this down a little bit more. When you look at soybean, cotton, and corn for the United States since 2017, Enlist has been sprayed on more than 125 million acres across those three crops. We just experienced our seventh consecutive year gaining market share. And then we already talked about that third bullet point, trait penetration, how many Enlist E3 soybeans were planted in the United States. and it was on 65% of those soybean acres in 2024. So of the 65% of those acres planted, what percentage of them received an application of Enlist herbicide? And, it was about 80%. 80% we call it spray rate, but 80% spray rate of Enlist herbicide on Enlist crops. And then, we talk about a clear difference in the countryside, and just to hit a few of them, maybe the main ones. There's quite a few, but um, we don't have the volatility or off-target movement that dicamba does, right? So when we're talking about, comparing two different weed control systems, we simply don't have the volatility or the off-target movement that dicamba does. We can be tank mixed legally with glufosinate. That's another major one that we like to differentiate with. And then just the overall tank mix flexibility that you get with Enlist and an AMS. We don't have stipulations regarding, DRAs or VRAs, and as of today, there's no label for dicamba over the top use. So again, just to call out some clear differences, and then that reliable supply that we've been able to provide, our distribution partners and retail partners to make sure that you guys get it where you want it, when you need it, in a reliable fashion. So I just wanted to hit a few of the highlights, let you know the success that the technology is having. And then, Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you, and maybe you
Yep.
could go through a quick application update.
Yep. So, good morning, everyone. As you can imagine, we've been on a great journey here at Corteva Agriscience for several years with wide area adoption of the Enlist Weed Control System. The first portion of this webinar is really going to revolve around the BMPs of an Enlist Weed Control System. Now, keep in mind, even though you may be in an area where there's a high market penetration, we still see new adopters. So that's why we do cover the basics each and every time. And then we're going to go into some of the more common questions we get coming from the field. Okay. So we'll break this down into two parts. If you have questions, as Mike indicated, please use that Q&A feature. We may address it. Mike will kind of be our clearinghouse there. We might address it as we go through if it's relevant, or we might wait down to one of those Q&A sessions. Now, just to remember here, when you think about the Enlist Weed Control System, and this is an ever-changing marketplace we're in, but there is one constant that comes with the Enlist Weed Control System, and that is herbicide tolerance flexibility. Whether you're talking about Enlist soybeans, E3 soybeans, Enlist corn, whether that's Vorseed, PowerCore Ultras, Enlist Smart Stacks, or Enlist cotton, you always will have 2,4-D choline tolerance, glyphosate, glufosinate, and with our corn, that is also brings FOB tolerance. Now that's something to keep in mind, that we're offering you more flexibility. When you think about, as Mike indicated, we're now really the only over-the-top auxin product that has a legal label. But as we go forward in corn market, we know some of our the competitive traits out there are removing glufosinate. So we're taking some tools out from the competition, but with the Enlist corn, you have more options. Not that you have to use or exercise all of them, but absolutely more flexibility. Just to kind of reiterate, when you look at the marketplace, Enlist One is our straight goods 2,4-D choline with Colex D technology, is by far and away what a majority of our retailers, growers, and applicators are using, because it does give you the option there, whether you need a glyphosate-based system or a glufosinate-based system in soybeans, same way with cotton, or just another tank mix partner. When you start thinking about bringing in the mix of corn, we give a lot of flexibility. Over 1,700 different products are approved as tank mix partners. Now, for some growers out there where glyphosate is still working, they love that convenient pre-mix package. That's where Enlist Duo comes into play, where you still get that multiple modes of action, but it's a great fit for that acre, because we know that early in the spring or early in the season when we have cool weather, sometimes 2,4-D, and depending on the glyphosate, they can salt out. Where in the case of Enlist Duo, we don't have that concern. Obviously, at the very bottom, we have all those hard to control weeds that we're all dealing with no matter what commodity you're planting. Now, as you look at I'm going to go high level BMPs here, folks. But when you look over at the left and you look down at those, what I call just key bullet points, many of you are probably going to say, Eric, that's just common sense. And you're right, it is basic weed science principles. But when we're starting to deal with the resistance that we have seen and it continues to grow, we really need to adhere specifically to these principles, or we're going to continue to abuse and ultimately develop resistance out there in the countryside that makes all these technologies obsolete. Okay, so let's kind of start off with some of these to first start with the weed height. Now, shown here, and I'm going to use a lot of examples as we go through here, folks. Some of these will be greenhouse, some will be small trial, some are many years of data. Here was just one study looking at 2 to 4 inch weeds, 5 to 6 inch weeds, 10 to 12 inch weeds. Now, keep in mind, once we get to 10 to 12, that's off label, but we do recognize that is sometimes the reality in certain parts of the field. It's quite easy to see when we, regardless of the herbicide you're using, and Enlist One is no different, when we're actively going out on small weeds, that 2 to 4 inch, we get exceptional control. As those weeds continue to grow, there'll be times where we get excellent control on a certain weed species out there in the field because it's maybe easier to control, where others like common water hemp, common lamb's quarter, now you're back into a respray with 80%, 76% control. Now, what really is driving that is this right here, is the number of growing points we're really trying to attack on that plant. So like over on the left, you have approximately 9 growing points at 2 inches. Fairly easy to control. We don't have to get too aggressive with our tank mix partners or even our other additives. When you start to get to that 4 to 6 inch, now you're at that upper end of that label. Now we've got 18 growing plus points that we've got to get good control, especially when you're using a product that's non-translocated and as a contact like glufosinate that's in the marketplace. Great product. We've got to get good coverage to get all those growing points if we're going to get effective control. And that becomes the challenge. And when you start getting larger than that, even if you took your shoes off, folks, there's not enough places to count all the growing points on that plant. It's just so big and so hard to control. Now, that's just on height. Let's start thinking about Mother Nature and what that may bring. Now, looking over here at the very top, this is looking at water hemp control relative to moisture stress. Now, you're looking at some very reduced rates. Keep in mind, these are done in the greenhouse. We tend to get a little better control in a greenhouse because we've optimized a lot of conditions there versus the field. So that's why we go to reduced rates. But where we had no stress, we were in that 83 to 85% control. If we induce drought prior to that application or 7 days prior, we can see control fell off dramatically, almost half, whether that was an auxin herbicide or even a group 9 being glyphosate. When we had that moisture stress after an application, control also decreased, but it wasn't as severe. That probably really doesn't shock anyone. As we start to get drier after an application, hopefully we get rapid uptake, and we're going to talk about that as well. And then we start looking at that percent reductions and just converting those numbers. That's a big difference in weed control out there just due to moisture stress. Now, generally speaking, in 2024, we did not have the moisture stress we had in 2023. Probably had too much moisture early, then we did not have enough late. And depending on where you stood, you just had too much all the way around. But moisture stress is one of those things, or environmental stress can have a huge consequence. The other thing we talk about is using full rates. Now, on our first original label, we had a rate range. With our re-registration, we went to a full label rate, which is at 32 ounces or 2 pints of Enlist One. Now, when you look across the various species, this was work that was done from 2004 to 2011, looking at university trials, internal trials. You'll see the number of trials under each weed species, glyphosate-resistant weeds over on the right. You can see even at a 1 pint rate, we got exceptionally good control. But when we went to that full rate, we started to really even out the abnormalities or the ups and downs, and we started to see really good consistent control, about 89%, which is exceptional. We know we've got a powerful tool with Enlist One herbicide. But what we've always preached from the very beginning is this. We want 2 effective modes of action. If glyphosate, in this case, is still working for you, by all means, you get 2 modes of action. You start to sharpen up that control on a few of these weed species, and that's what we want to see. On the other hand, if glyphosate's not, we want you to substitute in a product like glufosinate. Point being, we want 2 modes of action here, and that's at effective rates. Once you've got the right weed height, you've got the right rates, we want to make sure we have the right nozzles. And if you go to enlist.com, go to the website there, and you can find these approved nozzles. There's a lot of nozzles out there. You want to make sure you're using the appropriate nozzle to give you that spectrum of control. And we'll talk about it in a little bit of not only quality of spray, but we're also doing the right GPA. So for example, looking at an AIXR nozzle here at the very top left at 10 GPA compared to a TTI nozzle, which is an ultra coarse nozzle, also at 10 GPA. For lack of words, kind of the Enlist nozzle on the left, the dicamba nozzle on the right. You can see just by choosing the right nozzle, I can get almost double the effective coverage with an AIXR as I can with a TTI. Now, there are some crops and commodities that we're around where we have such sensitive areas out there or sensitive species or susceptible crops, and we really want that added drift protection. If you need to use a TTI, what we would encourage you to do is just up your GPA to 20 gallons per acre. So if you look at that lower right-hand corner and compare it to the top left, now we're getting very equivalent area covered. We just needed to double our GPA. And if you did that with an AIXR, once again, you got that doubling of coverage just compared to 10 GPA. So there's a lot of ways you can mix and match nozzles depending on what you're trying to achieve. And then another aspect to this is once you've got the right nozzle, do we have the right deposition aids or additives that are in the tank? What you're actually looking at here is through a microscope, where on the top left, we actually sprayed Enlist-1 herbicide on a leaf, and you're actually be able to see the stomata or the openings on that leaf. We had to zoom in 1,500 times to get that droplet to show up in the microscope. Now, when we added non-ionic surfactant, we actually had to back that out to about 850. The reason is non-ionic surfactant spread that across the leaf. So we had to back the microscope out so we could actually see the whole droplet on the leaf surface. But that's just it. It just spread it out. When we added COC or MSO at the very bottom, we had to actually zoom out just a little bit further. But you can compare that COC, you're starting to see subtle cratering of that cuticular or epicuticular wax on the outside of that leaf. And when you get to that MSO, you even see it more prevalent. That's the burn you typically will see in a commodity, whether that's corn, cotton, or soybeans. But if we get to the wrong conditions, hot and dry conditions as an example, we really, generally speaking, we need to add the COCs and MSOs to the tank to help get that product into the plant so we can get good control of your weeds. Now, just kind of summary. That's the basic high-level summaries here of why we recommend some of these basic principles. They've always been the foundation for good weed control. The Enlist weed control system is no different. Those principles are still absolutely appropriate and necessary so we have long-term longevity of this system. So now let's kind of switch gears a little bit and start talking about some of the frequently asked questions. I think they'll dovetail in. Then we'll have the first Q&A session. One question we get a lot in the field is, should I use AMS, other spray adjuvants, and what rate with Enlist herbicide? You know, a loaded question where we've got a customer there going, there's so much information out there. What do I really need to add into the tank to make sure we're using and getting effective good weed control? Well, first off, let's talk about AMS. You know, when we add ammonium sulfate to the tank, we typically want to add that first because the whole point of adding AMS is to basically counteract those positive charged metals, whether that's calcium, iron, manganese, magnesium, or sodium. Depending on where you're staying in the United States, you could have any of those present in your water, especially if it's well water or groundwater. And also, too, and I'm going to say here basically in the Midwest and North, we also tend to get kind of a bump in weed control through uptake and translocation. If you're farming in the Mid-South or the Southern U.S., because of the high humidity that's typically present in the South, you may not see that bump, or we very seldom see the bump per se. But adding AMS to counter any hard water is still very appropriate. When you look over on the very right-hand side, you can see we're looking at 2,4-D here on common lamb's quarter, 21 days after treatment. We have deionized water, so it has no charge. Whether we had 2,4-D amine alone or with AMS, there was basically no difference. But where you see a huge impact with calcium and manganese. So in essence, that difference in weed control, when we added AMS to the tank in those green bars, we were able to overcome that negative impact out there. So AMS is absolutely critical. Now, depending on the labels, we'll add anywhere from 8.5 to 17 pounds of AMS per 100. That's kind of the old rate range. 2.5% volume per volume, typically speaking for a liquid. But depending on your spray volume, we want to make sure we're in that 1.5 to 2 pounds minimum on a per acre basis. Because on a volume basis, there's a huge difference between 20 GPA, 15 GPA, and 10 GPA when you're going out on a per acre basis. Let's also look at some of just the pH effect. Now, when you start looking at pH, and obviously we add AMS to the tank to lower that pH, you can see that we typically optimize in greenhouse conditions here. This was Enlist 1. Again, very low rate, a half a pint because of the greenhouse. But we got the best control of these weeds when that pH was lower. If at near neutral, it was okay. But as we start to get higher pH, we start to see that control drop off. At the very bottom is just looking at what's the difference between no AMS and with AMS. And again, you'll see that it ultimately mirrors that pH around 4. Typically, a lot of our pHs will end up in that 5.2 to 5.5, depending on where you started. But again, it shows really the importance of why we add AMS to the tank. We also talked about surfactants. Generally speaking, we do not recommend NIS in an Enlist application. Non-surfactant is a great product. It is needed with many of the chemistries we use in ag. But when we get into the Enlist weed control system, usually we're talking about a crop oil concentrate, a methylated seed oil, or a high surfactant modified oil concentrate, whether that's a what I call a COC based or methylated seed oil based, regardless, it's still that modified oil. Now, once again, those typically are going out about 1% volume per volume. But as you go from 20 to 10 or 15 GPA, again, depending on what you're spraying, you may want to readjust your rates there to give you an equivalent rate per acre, somewhere in that 20 to 25 ounces kind of minimum per se. Now, those rates can be adjusted depending on if you're adding in other oil-based products in the tank. Take, for example, you're going out mid-season, you're going to put a residual that is an EC-based residual, and it's very hot out. You may want to drop these down to about 0.5% volume per volume. So there is flexibility. We just got to make sure we understand why we're using and what rate we're using. And again, we've already talked about the overall why we bring those in. It's a great visual just to kind of reinforce why we're doing or why we're adding certain things to the tank. So Mike, I think that kind of gets us here almost not quite to the bottom of the hour, but what kind of questions we've got so far coming in?
All right, Eric, what is the rate of glufosinate in Enlist Duo?
Oh, okay. Well, the question is on Enlist Duo. So basically, is glyphosate first off, not glufosinate, but you're getting basically a 1 pound of active ingredient there. So it used to be the equivalent of basically what a 28 ounce rate of Power Max would be today. It is not Roundup Power Max, but that's obviously one of the lead products out in the marketplace. That's going to give you the same equivalent rate on an AI basis. Different surfactants, all that, but that's about the same amount of AI.
All right. Eric, another one here. Did you notice any cases of antagonism this year with different tank mixes?
So really, when it comes to tank mixes and antagonism, typically speaking, if we're going to see antagonism, folks, it's not going to be with broadleaf control, but it will be with grass control. Should not be a shock to anyone when we add a corn killer, whether that's a DIM category or a FOP chemistry in soybeans. We've known for 30 years when you add a group 4, which is that auxin chemistry, to the ACCA's products out there, we tend to see a drop in control because they antagonize each other. The way we overcome that is making sure, one, we just increase that corn killer or grass killer out there by about a third. If you're going out and you've got a glyphosate in the tank, you probably won't see any of this unless you're looking at volunteer corn. Where it really becomes important is when you're doing glufosinate tank mixes. We know glufosinate will control very small grasses, but that's one of glyphosate's strengths. In those cases, it's really important in those glufosinate-based programs, we get that rate up by about a third and add in a crop oil. So that's where we'll see it. We see it every year to some degree, but it's probably no more prevalent last year than it has been any other year.
That's good. Eric, looks like there's two more here, and then
Yep.
we can keep rolling. Let me get back here. There we go. Have there been any studies with final solution pH and efficacy on weeds?
So yes, it's a great question. Obviously, as you add more and more products to the tank, you're adjusting that pH up, down, depending on what you're adding into the tank. A prime example is if you start off at a near neutral pH and you add glyphosate, you're going to drop it down to around a 5.5, 5.4 in general. There's things that you could add that'll bring it back up slightly to near neutral. The challenge I would say is this. In general, as we get across lower pHs in the spray tank, we tend to optimize the weed control for many of our acid-containing products. I can't say that I've seen that studies. I'm sure they're out there. When you start to get to more like an atrazine or some of the HPPDs, maybe some of the PPOs, if they're impacted nearly as much as some of our acids, like a glyphosate or 2,4-D or dicamba, some of those products. But it's something that I'd call basic agronomic research that's been done for many years.
Okay, very good. And then one more here, maybe confirming what you had recently said with regards to AMS. The question is, did you say if not utilizing VV rates of AMS to utilize 2.5 pounds per acre of dry AMS? And is that a minimum?
So the question really becomes here, and it's what I would say it's up to each of you all as applicators. Obviously, one of the things I've always promoted is a minimum of 15 GPA at a minimum. And I typically will go 2.5% volume per volume on a liquid product. Or when you start thinking about that, if you said, I want to spray 10 GPA and I put in the same kind of equivalent, I'm going to get roughly about 2 pounds, 1.5 to 2 pounds on a per acre basis. But when I go up to 20 GPA, now I'm even more. So you kind of have to adjust your rate on AMS on a per acre basis. COCs, MSOs, those additives are really no different as well. You know, the more at a 1% volume per volume, you're not getting as much COC at a 10 GPA as you are at 20 GPA. So again, it's you're trying to make sure you can optimize those on a per acre basis. We talk about them on a volume per volume or on a 100-gallon basis, but sometimes you kind of need to think back a little bit. What am I really delivering on that per acre? So hopefully that answered that question.
Yep.
Okay, folks, again, we'll have another Q&A here in about 30 minutes. If you've got questions, by all means, make sure you add them into the Q&A feature, and we'll continue to look at some of the key questions. Now, one question we get a ton, folks, is what's the difference between 2,4-D choline and other 2,4-D formulations? And probably the way to put it is growers really want to know, is it worth spending all that extra money? Well, first off, realize there's a huge difference there between 2,4-D choline with Colex-D technology and an unauthorized product. Not only is it illegal to spray an unauthorized 2,4-D over the top, it actually will jeopardize the whole Enlist weed control system. We've seen that right now when we had illegal use out in the countryside of dicamba or off-target movement that compromises stewardship in general, and hence why we're seeing that we do not have a current label today. When you compare those, and we'll look at them side by side, when you're using Enlist 1 with Colex-D or Enlist Duo with Colex-D, you're going to get a 90% less drift than a traditional 2,4-D formulations with the same other AIs in the tank with a traditional nozzle. That's one of the reasons why we only have approved tank mix partners that can go in the tank, because we do not want to compromise that physical drift. The other aspect is just sheer volatility. We know that the esters and amines can volatilize. Most of you would say, well, I've been using them for years, and you have. You've been using them typically in a range and pasture or a burn down situation. Much cooler, not warm temperatures. You did not have some of the natural environmental considerations that drive volatilizations. When you start making those applications in June, July, it's a different world. But by having that low volatility here of the Enlist 1 or near zero volatility, we're minimizing it. And that's once again why we were able to bring this system. The other key aspect to all of this is, as of today, in general, 2,4-D formulations have not gone through their ESA. Enlist One and Enlist Duo have. In fact, we really paved the way for other registrants and other products out there. We probably had more products go through an ESA assessment than any other company. We know we have the freedom to operate all the way through 2029. And based off the sound science, the formulations and attributes we've delivered, we feel very confident moving forward past 2029 because we've built a very sound system. Now, when I say sound, we've looked at a lot of information. So the first is drift. When we worked with a lot of our universities, we did very large blocks out in the countryside at times where they were 2 and 3 acre blocks where we're looking at physical drift downwind. Now, obviously, if you have a susceptible crop and it is downwind, it's a do not spray regardless. But one of the things we've been able to bring in with Enlist Weed Control, Enlist One and Duo is soybeans are not considered a susceptible crop, even if they are downwind. As long as you're following our label and our recommendations, the science here clearly shows that our product just doesn't move when you're matching up the right nozzles. This can be even seen further. So take, for example, I know not to get too complicated here, folks, but I think we all know that tomatoes are fairly sensitive to 2,4-D. If you ever sprayed your yard or around a vegetable garden and you got a little 2,4-D on your wife or your mom or grandma's tomatoes, somebody was not happy. 2,4-D amine versus Enlist One. We looked at an XR nozzle, an AIXR nozzle, and looked how far downwind. Again, this should have been a do not spray, but we were looking at if that movement over to tomatoes, how far did it go before we stopped seeing damage? Well, in 2,4-D amine, there really wasn't a big difference between an XR or AIXR. But when you look at Enlist One with XR, which is again not an approved nozzle, we had less physical drift than 2,4-D amine and even all the other nozzles. When we use that approved nozzle, that AIXR, we cut that down by about 60% compared to other nozzles out there. When we tank mix this with glyphosate and other products, we see a 90% reduction. That's where that number comes from. So not only are we seeing less physical drift, but the bottom chart also looks at about how much is damaged there. Once again, that's about a 60% reduction when you compare that to 2,4-D amine. When you go out, if you were to go out and use an unauthorized 2,4-D, non-Enlist One or Duo, the other big instance here is, folks, it's 100% on you. Insurance is not going to pick up any damage or off-target movement that occurs through physical application. But you're saying, okay, Eric, I can get it to stop there. I'm gonna wait till the perfect day and I'm gonna just beat the system. Okay. First thing I'll say is good luck. Because here's what we built in with 2,4-D choline. 2,4-D amine, 2,4-D choline, 2,4-D ester. Those are all salt formulations. Ultimately, the 2,4-D enters the plant as an acid. It is the salt formulation that makes it stable on the leaf surface over time frame. So you may have done everything correct that day, but even after a 70 hours, we're still seeing ester volatilize off. We're seeing amine. We're seeing near zero, a 96% reduction compared to the ester and almost near 90 versus amine. This is one of the problems that dicamba also too has and other auxin chemistries is that we know that even though if you made the right application today, they can get up and walk for the next few days. And once again, you would be held liable for any damage to any off-target areas. And that wind could have changed in all directions over that 3-day period. Another key reason why not to be spraying and stewarded the product correctly. And this has been proven numerous times. Look at this is a cotton example. This was work done down in Georgia, where they actually sprayed about a 2-acre bare ground. If my memory's right here on these trials. And after that, they went out and put cotton plants starting at due north and at every 45 degrees all the way around. And they were looking at volatility coming off the soil compared to an ester, amine, and choline. And what we found was we did just that. Now, these are even at 2X labeled rates, but Enlist 2,4-D choline, which is Enlist One or Enlist Duo, we saw near only a 5% injury, and those tend to be right next door, that first set of plants which were right next to that application. Again, we spent a lot of time and money to develop a product that stays put not only the day of application, but the subsequent days coming after an application. You don't have that assurance. And it's one of the reasons why we probably would not be labeled had we not developed that. The other key thing to think about this too, folks, is, and I know, and we'll be the first to say, we recognize the economy is tight going into 2025. But we spend around $4 million a day on R&D investments to bring new tools, new technologies, new traits, new herbicides, the whole package to you so that not only you can continue to farm, but also the next generation in your family can continue to farm. And that's why we're doing our stewardship and doing our due diligence here. Unauthorized products out there in the countryside, they don't bring that kind of investment at all to your operation. You might save a few dollars today. I realize that. But at the end of the day, what could it cost you over your lifetime or your children's lifetime by using those unauthorized products? It ultimately can slow down the advancements we're making here in the US. Those are the reasons why there's a huge difference. Now, one other key question we get a lot of times. We're Enlist soybeans. We like what we're doing Enlist soybeans. Why, when you bring Enlist technology to Enlist corn, aren't you really just promoting resistance? And very valid question. I want you to make sure everyone understands fully the way we're approaching soybeans is this. We know, and as Mike had indicated, there's approximately about an 80% spray rate. I don't see that going up any higher because as you continue to see more conversion, there's some folks that just have very good or low weed pressure. They're still able to maybe use one or two modes of action like a glyphosate, glufosinate, maybe some PPOs, whatever the case may be. They don't need to spray Enlist one. They like having that reassurance there, but they just really don't need it. So I don't see that spray rate going up, but we do know when you buy E3 soybeans, there's a high likelihood you're going to spray them. When it comes to corn, we're trying to offer you more options in corn. Again, tolerances to 2,4-D choline, glufosinate, glyphosate, and FOP tolerance. Okay. Now keep in mind, annually, depending on where you're standing in the U.S., it can range from 20 up to 30% of the acres are going to receive a dicamba application, whether that's Clarity, Banville, Sterling Blue, Diflex, name your product, status. We know if you've been around any of those products and never had to use them, the reason growers are using them is because other chemistries they're using post-emerge aren't bringing what they once were from a weed control perspective. We're starting to see resistance show up and they need another mode of action in the tank. I've never met a grower yet that likes or sleeps well for the next 48 or 72 hours after dicamba in corn. Worried about brittleneck, twisting, and hopefully we just don't get a wind event and snap it off. That peace of mind is really what we're going after with Enlist corn. By substituting out that dicamba, bringing in the Enlist 1 or Enlist Duo in there and adding it, again, adding it to what you're doing, we can supplement and give that peace of mind not only your corn, but also minimize that off-target movement to your next door neighbor, whether that's your soybean field or a neighbor's soybean field, which is, again, more than likely an E3 soybean field. We can really maximize the system of both fields there by just making good common sense decisions. And we know that when we do multiple modes of action pre-plant and pre, we do multiple modes of action post, and in those unique situations, we add in Enlist 1. Again, not a replacement, an addition, we can get effective weed control. And studies have shown here, this was a study done by Purdue, where basically the gray bars being 2014, 2016, 2018, those are the soybean years. There's basically 4 programs, and I won't go into great detail, but a simplified version is this. A diversified glyphosate, where we had diversified modes of action pre, post, but it was glyphosate based. We did the same thing with the diversified 2,4-D. Fully diversified was one where we just had as many modes of action that we could in each crop. And then we had a 2,4-D reliant, where in many cases, maybe not a pre, down, and we relied almost solely on that 2,4-D to do all the heavy lifting. First off, when you look at weed densities and weed species changes, it should come as no shock we're seeing increases in the soybean years because 2,4-D doesn't have grass control. But where we do and use multiple modes of action pre and post and bring in the Enlist 1, we see hardly any difference compared to a fully diversified or diversified glyphosate. Once again, a sound principle here. If we're managing our modes of actions correctly, 2,4-D, in this case, Enlist 1, can be a very effective tool in soybeans and also in corn when used properly. So Another one, why doesn't Corteva Agriscience promote or support spraying Enlist One herbicide alone? Folks, we realize that 2025, it's going to be a challenging year. We understand that. But when you look back through history, Enlist One, it is an amazing product. I'll be first to admit, I had the opportunity to work on it for about 8 or 9 years before an R&D, before I came to commercial. I know it delivers a lot of value. But if you look over on the right-hand side and you start looking back or thinking back all the way to the early 80s and 90s, when we relied on any one mode of action to do all the lifting, we developed resistance. I cannot think of one instance throughout the past 30 or 40 years where we did only rely on one thing that we haven't developed resistance. It takes us approximately 300 some million dollars, 12 years to bring a new trait and or a new herbicide solution to market. If we burn out this technology right now because of poor resistance management, it's going to take us quite some time to bring the next mode of action out, which we're working on as we speak, but we're still a ways away. That is why we've always recommended from day one using multiple modes of action. Why do I need to worry about rainfall after an Enlist herbicide application? And this is kind of a loaded question to a certain degree. There's two things I want to talk about here. First off, with the new ESA standards out there, we all have to be concerned about physical runoff from the field into an endangered area or an area where an endangered species can reside. That's why on our labels, and you'll see this not only in our products, but other products coming up, you'll see the verbiage to say anticipated rainfall event, do not apply within 48 hours. It's not because we're worried that we're going to get washed off the leaf here, because in this case, Enlist One and Enlist Duo have a rain fastness of about 4 hours. We know that it's going to be enough there to give us good control. What that 48-hour restriction on our labels really revolves is we don't want to get washed off the plant or move with soil to an outlying area outside the field and have a negative impact on an endangered species or their food source. So there's a difference there. But if you solely look at what happens after you sprayed and you start to get a rain event at 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, or 24, what is it going to impact? Well, shown here is looking at that 2,4-D choline on the leaf, on palmer, common water hemp, giant ragweed, and horseweed. 4 different weed species. And what you're looking at 0 hours, that's kind of the maximum amount that's going to be on that leaf. It hasn't really been taken in to the leaf, but that's on the leaf surface. At 2 hours, we had about 50% of it got in the leaf. After 4 hours, about 65. And about after 24 hours, we got 92% of it is in the leaf. We need to make sure that we have that rain-free period to ensure we're getting enough of this product in the leaf to control that given weed species. And as you can see, that varies quite dramatically depending on the weed species that we're talking about. That's the reason why we should really be concerned about having a rainfall event after an application. So another question is, why is glufosinate herbicide not working on weeds with or without Enlist? This is one that's kind of, we get a lot, whether that's an Extend system previously, where they're planting Extend beans using glufosinate and glyphosate, or they're tank mixing it. Well, I would say about 95% of the time when I hear that question, it really goes back to the basics. First off, glufosinate is not glyphosate. We have to treat them differently. Glufosinate is a contact product. It is not a translocated product. So with that said, we've got to treat it more, in my opinion, and I think the data would really clearly back it up, how we do our PPO products or our burners, like be it Blaze or Cobra, those types of products that we use in season. So that means small weeds. The reason that we need small weeds is we got to get good coverage. This is a product that likes AMS, where you'll see typically a lot of the recommendations coming out of BASF, and I would agree, are anywhere from 1.5 to 3 pounds per acre. Okay. The window time of application is really not that different, but the volumes. If you're going to put glufosinate out at 10 GPA, folks, I can give you my address. Just mail me the check you were going to spend, because we'll both, at least I'll be happy with something, because you're not going to be happy with the weed control you get at 10 GPA. It goes back to the coverage. If you're going to spray it at 20 GPA and you're doing the other things correct, I think you'll be very happy. You also have to optimize your nozzles. If you're going out with a TTI style product or a nozzle, those extra coarse or ultra coarse nozzles, you're not going to be happy with a glufosinate application. That's why the AIXRs, the twin jets, those are the ones that typically we recommend in that glufosinate-based system with Enlist. And when we kind of maximize these things, again, the basic principles around good weed management, we get good coverage, we get good control when we do the right things. 90% of the time, folks, when I get that question, when we start investigating, we found one or two of these things that really weren't optimized. Not always the grower's fault. Mother Nature plays part of that, and we just can't get in, but it can easily be rectified and figured out where we can make some improvements. Will the Enlist weed control system control kochia? That's one we typically get mainly in the northern states where we have wheat growing areas. And we know this, when you use the systems approach, when you think about a system, that just isn't Enlist alone. That's our pre-emerge products like Valor, Sonic, Metribuzin containing products. Kyber Pro is a new product we just launched this year. When we got good modes of action, multiple effective modes of action pre, and use Enlist 1 in a glufosinate-based system, we get excellent control. We know that, generally speaking, a lot of the kochia out there is glyphosate resistant. So we can get excellent control by doing that, even though Enlist 1 by itself is not what we would consider anywhere near achievable or effective control. It's not a 0, but it sure isn't a 95 to 100. When we put the two together with the glufosinate and do the other things, we do get exceptional control. And also layering in the in-season residuals like that we can do in our Group 15 chemistry helps to minimize future flushes throughout the season. Why do Enlist soybeans show cupping? This is one we still get every year. Folks, as much as I hate to say it, I think this has been proven time and time again. When do we typically see cupping? Not in every instance will this always be dicamba, folks. We all know that. But generally speaking, what we're seeing out in the industry is dicamba. Now, one thing that always kind of amazes farmers is once we get to a certain population of E3 soybeans and we don't see the Extend system as much being sprayed, generally speaking, off-target movement goes away, cupping goes away. When we get into our transition zones, as we get out into Nebraska, the Dakotas, where that transition zone, as we get towards moving west, we see fields of cupping because there's a lot of dicamba that's still either off-target movement, volatilized and moved off target, and that's been documented time and time again. It's not the only reason you can get cupping in the field, but I would say majority of the time, that's where you're seeing this come from. Can I use my dicamba nozzles to spray Enlist herbicides? It's a great question. We all know what the cost of nozzles are, and that's why we do make some recommendations here when you go to our website. Generally speaking, the nozzles that we have here highlighted in green, those are really utilized to optimize spray quality and performance of the nozzle. If you needed added drift protection, that's where we would get into those kind of in a yellow. And depending where you're farming, there might be a good reason why you needed to use a one that we call a yellow. But what we're trying to really understand here, and that's why I would always encourage you, I'm just highlighting the T-Jets here. There's a lot of great manufacturers out there, Wilger, Hypro, others, John Deere, etc. Look at their books, but look at the PSI ranges you're going to be running. In this case, a TTI, you've got the ultra coarse or extra coarse spectrum of droplets there, depending on the orifice size. When you're comparing that to an AIXR, we're now down to a coarse, very coarse, or on the low end, an extra coarse. So we're able to move that nozzle by choosing to a different nozzle and the right orifice. We can get a more ideal droplet spectrum to really optimize that performance. It doesn't mean you can't use a TTI. Just recognize you're going to have big drops out there compared to an AIXR. If you've got a translocated product like glufosinate, that's why we tend to go more towards an AIXR. Otherwise, you can sacrifice your weed control. If you throw a DRA on top of this, that's one of the reasons why we typically do not recommend and won't recommend a DRA within Enlist system. It's almost like going up and making a comparison with an AIXR, moving it up to look like a turbo T-jet at the top. That's what DRAs generally speaking do. They minimize the fines and make the droplets bigger, typically speaking. So there's reasons why you can do them, but you've got to understand why you're utilizing those nozzles. Prime example. First off, recognize these are big weeds. When we use our spray booms that are handheld, we get pretty good performance, folks. So we went some extra tall weeds, 12 to 16, way off label. Hopefully you're not trying to tackle water hemp and some of those things that size. But on the left-hand side, we have TTI 11004, 20 GPA, fairly good GPA, full rates with AMS. Compare that to an AIXR in the middle. You see just visually, we have less green. We got better coverage with that AIXR. In turn, we got better control. Now by adding in the Enlist 1 to it at a 32 ounce or 2 pint rate, we even got better control. Now, I'm not here to say, folks, you need to go off label and wait till these weeds get big, but it shows the reason why we make our recommendations on certain nozzles and certain GPAs. It's all about coverage and getting good effective control. So the other one that's come up, and it's really from where we're at with the pulse width modulation systems and Enlist one herbicides. There's a lot of nozzles in there. Look at the book on our website. It'll show you the ones in green. Again, they're there to optimize coverage, or I'm just kind of going through here. So AITTJ60 that can be used with pulse width modulation systems, or if you need extra drift protection. Again, if you're down in an area where you just need that added drift protection, we can give that to you as well with these nozzles as well. Just recognize and look at that droplet spectrum, and you might maybe go down a nozzle size or increase your GPA to compensate for some of that. So folks, I know we've been going on here for a little bit. Just always want to reiterate, if you have any questions, always reach out to our website, enlist.com. You see at the very top, there's a ton of good information there, whether you want to know about herbicides, traits, the stewardship aspects, all the tank mixing guidance, or always reach out to your local retailer or your Corteva sales rep for any questions you may have. Again, from an Enlist stewardship perspective, we're bundling all these things together to make sure our customers, our applicators, the growers who utilize our technology know how to use our management resources. We try to provide training activities like today, whether that's in field, today it's a webinar in the winter, to make sure that as we go into that upcoming season, we can really try to optimize performance. And we're trying to really showcase the technology advancements we've brought to you all with Enlist One and Colex D. I know when you pick up a jug of that, it doesn't have bells and whistles and alarms on it. Probably should, because we've built a lot of technology in the jug. There is a difference compared to the generics and other 2,4-Ds out there. So with that, I will entertain any questions you have. Mike, I don't know if we got much in the, oh, we got, looks like we got several, so go ahead. And Mike, you're on mute.
Yep, sorry about that, everybody. Eric, yeah, we have about 3, maybe 4 here in the chat. First one is, what spray pressures are recommended when applying Enlist at 15 to 20 gallons an acre?
So obviously, depending on the nozzle that you're using, Eric, it's a great question. What I recommend, and it's kind of almost like a trick question today, because the days of saying your PSI, I still remember back in the days when back in the 80s watching my dad turn a knob up and down as we were going. All that's done rate controlled now, by and large, with our system, so we don't have to worry about that. But what we want to try to do, and that sounds kind of different, we want to be on the upper end of our approved range, so that ultimately when you start to slow down and that pressure decreases, like or on the turn rows, things like that, we're still getting that optimum coverage. If you're down on that lower end of pressure and then you start to turn and slow down, things like that, now you're getting these big bowling balls coming out, and it just doesn't give you good effective control.
It's good. When using 2,4-D ester or amine for burn down before Enlist beans, should you still have a waiting period before planting?
So folks, it's a great question. At the end of the day, you always have to abide by the particular label. When you look at, regardless if that's an ester or a amine, there is a plant back to beans, regardless if they are Enlist or non-Enlist. By law, you have to abide by that. And the reason I bring that up is if you were to make an application, let's say a day before, and for some reason it moved off target, you've not only had an off target application, but you've also technically broken your TUA and you've not used that product in accordance with the label. The reason that's important is that states get involved, things of that nature. You want to make sure you are covered correctly. And that's the reason I bring that up, just to make sure that you're doing the right things there.
All right, Eric, looks like we got 2 more maybe. How do you recommend we track runoff management coverage when using Enlist?
Say that one more time, Mike. Make sure I
Yeah.
understand the question.
Yeah, the question reads, how do you recommend we track runoff management measures per label?
Oh, okay. So one of the questions there, and if you go to our labels, folks, there is a runoff management section. Technically, by the label, you do not have to have written documentation. However, if you were to get audited, and we've had some retailers get audited, we've had a couple growers get audited. Surprisingly, that was a question they brought up. How did you address that? When you start looking at a lot of those particular measures, it's kind of a check the box system. So if you're doing a no-till, you get credit for that. If you're looking at residue, amount of residue, you can do a hula hoop method, do a few samples out there. That's one way of doing that to try to get a best guesstimate across the field. I think it's probably a good idea to document it personally, that you at least evaluate that prior to an application. So it's written, it's a documented on list application. But by law, you do not have to. But that is something that we're going to see implemented not only for Enlist, but other products as they come up for re-registration. They too will probably have something of that nature on their new approved labels once they come up for a re-reg. So it's something we're all going to deal with, folks. We might as well just get in the habit now and just be on the front end of this.
Right. We got a few more coming in too here, Eric. Um, is there a recommended max ground speed to get good coverage when using Enlist?
Um, Great question. As we increase speed of any application, we have to typically, to deliver that constant GPA, we're going to have to increase orifice size of the nozzle you're using. When you increase the orifice size, you're going to increase the size of the droplets coming out of that orifice. So what you're trying to do is really balance your speed with the volume you want on a per acre and the nozzle size to get that quality spray on a per acre basis or per square foot basis. I can't give you a really any answer because it again depends on what you're using. If you're trying to run somewhere between 15, 20 mile an hour, and I've seen it done, we all know it with the new systems and how well they ride, you can do it. But if you're using the wrong nozzle, you can be really sacrificing weed control. If you're down on the lower nozzles, like an 05, 06, or something like that, where you have a much finer orifice, you're getting a more uniform spectrum of spray quality out there or delivered in it, you're probably going to get really good control. So that's something I think, again, that's the reason I went and spent a little time today, folks, is it's just more than picking a nozzle. It's trying to really think how and what you're asking of that nozzle so that you can really deliver what you're trying to do. And that's good weed control.
That's good. Looks like maybe two more. For operators who are concerned about enlist beans being cupped and having a yield impact, and this would be in this example due to dicamba being sprayed on wheat XtendFlex soybeans or wheat stubble in the area. Do you have any suggestions on how to handle this objection?
Yeah, so obviously, and time will tell, folks. As we state today, there is no over-the-top label that is approved for any of the Extend system for dicamba. That is today. Um, Personally, I don't envision anything being approved in time to have an impact here in 2025. So in theory, that means there should be no dicamba being sprayed anywhere on beans post-emerge. Now, with that said, that's also got many of our states on edge because now it's really easy to start isolating where did this come from. When we had large segments out there that were spraying dicamba, whether that was an approved over the top or not approved, it was a real hard situation for them to prove. When there is nothing approved for beans, it's really easy to start figuring that out where this might have come from. And that applicator themselves could be now easily more identifiable and liable for damage. Not that we're trying to take any tools out of the toolbox, folks. That's not what we're saying. But if you've got damage, typically the first thing to realize is that damage on soybeans particularly showed up probably somewhere between 7 to 14 days prior when it actually occurred. There's a latent effect. And then you will see that damage for maybe a couple nodes. And then it will typically grow out of it if no new distribution or volatilization has occurred from somewhere in the area. It's not hard to start backtracking is what I'm getting at here, folks, and say who was making a dicamba application in that local area 7 to 14 days ago when there's really in a corn soybean area shouldn't be that much application being going on. It's going to be a real conundrum I think we'll find ourselves here in 2025. Folks, I know we got a few more questions here, Mike. We're at the top of the hour, folks. Mike and I will stay on here. Happy to continue answering questions. For those that need to jump, thank you as always for your business and your time. We greatly appreciate it. Hopefully you found this webinar provided a lot of new information, provoked some thought a little bit, and really kind of sharpen that sword for this upcoming spray season. So if you need to jump, by all means, and visit our website. For those that you can stay on, we will continue to answer questions. So, Mike?
That's great. And those that do have to jump, have a safe spring and reach out to your, local territory manager or, Corteva crop protection rep if you have any questions. And we look forward to seeing you again. We got a couple more of these in January as well as February and March slated. So, okay, Eric, you got three more here.
Yep.
What droplet size shows the best results when applying Enlist and glufosinate?
So, and I'll back up here, folks, and it's a tough question to answer, but I will use this diagram here as well. Again, when you think about what glufosinate is, it's one good product, but it's a contact product. It does behave differently than a glyphosate. We need to treat it like we do our other post-emergence PPOs that we used to use all the time, like Flexstar, Reflex, and so on, Blazer, Cobra. And that is where we want to be in that coarse to very coarse droplet spectrum. Now, the reason I say that is because we're now spreading those droplets out more across that leaf. For one example, one 500 micron droplet. Logic would say if I went down to 250, I took that 500 micron droplet and I went down to 250 microns, I don't end up with 2 droplets, I end up with 8 droplets. And if I took a 250 down to 125, I end up with 64 droplets now. So those stepwise changes have a huge impact on coverage. When you're at an ultra coarse or extra coarse, you end up with those big globules in a local area, but you're leaving a lot of area untouched on that leaf surface, whether that's a soybean, water hemp, common lamb's quarter velvet, it doesn't matter. You want to try to get good coverage. That's why we recommend, and even BSF would say that AIXR or a twin jet. And again, there's a lot of very similar style products for Hypro, Wilger, John Deere, just using this as an example.
That's great. Eric, looks like two more. Says, obviously 15 gallons an acre is preferred, but a lot of times farmers like to cut back on this volume. What things can we do to make sure farmers are successful at weed control when spraying at 10 to 12 gallons of water? Will adjusting pressure and nozzles help?
No, folks. Unfortunately, I mean, if you're using a glyphosate-based system and glyphosate is still working for you, you've got 2 translocated products. It can work. We know it will work. But if you're using glufosinate, and many of you are, we've seen that continued increase out there year over year, whether that's in the extend beans, because we need the glufosinate with the glyphosate, or you want to be proactive in your Enlist soybeans, it's all about coverage. You just can't get enough coverage out of 10 and 12 as you will at 15 and 20. It's all about coverage, simply put. If it were that easy, we'd all be using other nozzles that would deliver these ultra fines, and we could blanket that everywhere. The problem with those particular nozzles, like an XR nozzle, the things we started off with maybe 20 or 30 plus years ago, is they gave us great coverage, but they moved everywhere. And in today's atmosphere and what we're all trying to farm in, those kind of nozzles just aren't approved. That's why we can't utilize those. That's why we try to use AIXRs and try to balance that out. And to get the kind of coverage you need, you just got to be up at that 15 to 20 GPA.
That's great. Okay, last one here, Eric. How should the Enlist 1 and glyphosate be added to the spray tank to avoid any compatibility concerns?
So when you think about any compatibility concerns that exist, because everybody's got different water out there, what we would recommend is, filling, if you're you've had issues in the past with your water source, there's 2 things we can do quite easily. One, get at least around 50% of the volume of the tank with water, induct 1 product first. Do not commingle the products in the tank or in the induction tank. Make sure you might rinse it, just a quick rinse off, induct in the second product in there. I've seen glyphosate go first and then Enlist one. I've seen them both ways. As long as you keep the two products separate out of that induction tank and give it just a minute or two to kind of get dispersed in your main tank, we just don't see a lot of issues. Obviously, always make sure you're adding the AMS, folks, first for the full load, because the last thing we want to do is add the glyphosate and get it bound up, or the Enlist one, to some cations in the tank. But as long as you're separating, we just don't see a lot of issues, folks. We really don't, regardless of the glyphosate. I know that's become a question with Roundup Power Max 3. We know that in general, for whatever reason, that particular formulation of glyphosate seems to be a little more problematic with mixing across a lot of different products in the industry, not just soybean chemistry, but corn chemistry. But even then, we mix very well by just separating those two out.
Yep. And that was the last one there, Eric. So again, just want to say what Eric already said for those still on the line. Thank you so much for your business. We sincerely appreciate it. Look forward to another successful year with you. Have a safe spring. And again, reach out to your Corteva Crop Protection contact if you have any questions. And we'd love to see you back for the rest of a couple more webinars as we get through the spring. So thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Be safe.